This entire civilization exists because of inheritance and legacy. It's really that simple. Any hindrance on inheritance is a hindrance on the growth of the civilization. And the 100 inheritance tax is a case for starting up the rotors. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alright, so this is a topic that we briefly touched upon in the context of divorce at the beginning of this year in the video uploaded in January called The Economic Effects of Mass Divorce-Inheritance. So I suggest you watch that one too if you haven't seen it already. However, this particular story goes even one step further into insanity, demanding nothing less than a 100% inheritance tax, essentially abolishing inheritance altogether. Now, it is important to note that the author of the story we are about to read and delve into, Miss Abby Wilkinson, is a typical champagne socialist. Totalitarian socialism for thee, normality for me. This is typical with almost all of these middle-class left-wing pricks who write for The Guardian. As Charles Murray was noting in the book Coming Apart, the folks who see themselves as the elite, the journalists of the cathedral, the university professors, political opinionators, and so on and so forth, have continued to live a very conservative lifestyle whilst promoting degeneracy and socialism for the rest of us plebs. And Abby Wilkinson is a classical case. She wants 100% inheritance tax for everyone else, but she also expects to inherit some shekels and some real estate from her parents. So, with that in mind, let's dive into her article titled, "Why Not Fund the Welfare State with a 100% Inheritance Tax?" And we'll deconstruct it point by point. As usual, we're doing this to arm our side with more and hopefully better arguments. And this is particularly necessary in Europe, especially countries with already enormous inheritance taxes, like, France, where inheriting 2 apartments means you have to sell one of them so you can afford the inheritance levy for the other. Anyway, quote, "Like most of the British public, I disliked the Conservatives' dementia tax proposal during the election campaign. When you make someone's access to social care depending on giving up the money they intend to pass on to descendants, you risk encouraging them to struggle on without seeking the help they need. While you'd hope most people would prioritize the well-being of elderly family members over cold hard cash, it seems inevitable that some might delay organizing support for relatives to avoid depleting their future wealth. There are strong practical reasons for making essential public services free at the point of access, even when means testing would theoretically ensure only people who can afford it are required to pay directly. It is impossible to fully understand the value of universality if your only assessment criteria is redistributive efficiency." Alright, let's stop here for a moment. First of all, No, there are no strong practical reasons for making consumer goods like healthcare free at the point of access, which really means stealing from the responsible to fund it for the irresponsible. Now, of course, she obfuscates it by using the deliberately misleading phrase essential public services, even though it is obvious she means socialist hospitals with death panels, which is why this article is relevant, because the author shows multiple times that she knows what she's doing. She's being deliberately subversive and deliberately dishonest. That's why I mentioned the rotors in the intro. It's scum like this that harms civilization a lot more than your average economically illiterate Joe who simply doesn't know better. No, this one does know better, but chooses otherwise. Anyway, on to her argument. Ben Shapiro summarized it best. When it comes to healthcare, there are essentially three characteristics: affordability, accessibility, and universality. At any given moment in time, you can have only two of these three, but never all three of them. So in the case of Britain, the NHS has exactly one: universality. It's highly unaffordable, as it ruins the country's deficit, in part because, like all other socialist bureaucracies, it's poorly run, and it's nowhere near as accessible, unless you consider 4 months waiting to see a GP as accessible, that is, if you're lucky, in which case we're clearly operating with highly different definitions, yours, of course, being the wrong one. So, under these conditions, the practical reasons are on the free market end, as the free market makes stuff affordable and accessible. Yes, it doesn't make them universal, but it makes them very close to that. If the market could make smartphones nearly universal, including in very poor countries, it is essentially delusion to think that the market couldn't make most healthcare near universal in a first world country. And for the remaining cases, the fabric of the society can pick up the slack. And here comes the rub. The fabric of the society has been and is being progressively destroyed by the Maximal Nanny State. And in the following lines, same thing, Abby Wilkinson will explain to us why another important part of what we normal people call the fabric of the society must also be crushed by the Maximal State. Quote, "Politics is a funny business, though, and the inevitable reduction of every complex issue into a simple binary conflict, or very occasionally a three-way tussle, means you can often find yourself in possession of some unlikely allies. Whilst arguing against the dementia tax on the basis that it creates perverse incentives and fails to spread the financial burden among all those who can afford to pay, I found that the most common objection seemed to be against dipping into inheritance at all. The idea that we should be able to pass on our life's accumulated wealth to descendants is deeply embedded. It appeals to the fundamental biological urge to protect our offspring and propagate our genes. Though only a small minority of estates are subject to inheritance tax in Britain as it currently stands, opinion polls consistently find that the majority of people oppose it. Instinct seems to override common sense. VAT falls disproportionately on people with low incomes, but it's far less hated." Now, that was a very nice obfuscation. Let me read it again. Instinct seems to override common sense. VAT falls disproportionately on people with low incomes, but it's far less hated. Now, I am impressed. This, my fellow deplorables, is scientific lying. 50% truth, 30% lie, and 20% spin. Yes, it is true that VAT is essentially a regressive tax and thus disproportionately affects low-income individuals. Yes, it is true that it is far less hated, but AB doesn't give you any analysis as to why this is the case. Why is VAT less hated? And if she were to tell you that, then the gullible reader wouldn't fill in the gaps in his mind with the leftist narrative that the rich are classist and don't care, which, even if it were true, it would still not be a good explanation since the rich already pay disproportionately into the system. Anyway, part of the reason VAT is less hated is because you don't see it. If a product costs, let's say, £10, the store will not list £10, but 12. The VAT is automatically included in the price. Now, this is convenient, but it also has the effect of hiding how much the government steals from you. This is why I like the American and the Canadian system, where the taxes are not included in the displayed price. So you always know which part of the price is the actual price of the entrepreneur and which part of it is the governmental theft. Another reason why VAT is not hated that much is because a lot more people can get behind on what is essentially a consumption tax than behind income or property taxes. Basically, taxing outcome rather than income is a better trade-off. If it were in my ideal world, the only tax would be a sales tax or a VAT or some similar form. It's easier to collect, harder to avoid. I mean, after all, it's the only tax that I haven't personally figured out how to avoid. And it also provides healthier incentives. It encourages saving rather than spending. Now that is how you build a sound civilization, by saving up and being conservative with your finances. As for the lie part in her obfuscation, namely that, quote, instinct seems to override common sense, unquote. Now this one is easy to debunk. Instinct is common sense. That's why it is the easiest to get people to agree with things they instinctively know to be true, no matter their political leaning, such as the fact that there are only two sexes and that everything else is mental disorder. At least 98% of the population agrees with this outright, no questions asked. And they'll say it's common sense, which is true. But the reason this is common sense is because virtually everyone instinctively knows this to be true and functional. Alright, so now we get into the core of her argument. Quote, understandable sensitivity around issues relating to death make it difficult to discuss, but it is time this conventional wisdom was held up to proper scrutiny. Yes, the desire to pass on property to your descendants may be natural, but why should we be slaves to our biology? Social progress has frequently depended on our ability to transcend individualistic urges and work together for the common good. Now, you can't get more buzzwords in a paragraph even if you tried. Nevertheless, it is an argument that appears to be compelling, even though it really isn't, precisely because it is well phrased. Now, if this were brought up to me in a live debate, I would ask her to give me 5 or 3 examples of what she thinks is both A, a social progress, and B, achieved via our ability to transcend individualistic edges and work together for the common good. Now, asking this and getting an answer gives you a clear insight in what is the mental framework of the interlocutor. But since we're not in a live debate, we'll work with what is given to us. So, the best way to counteract this that I can think of right now is to remind everyone that not all issues are created equal. And then also remind everyone that whenever we manifested, quote, our ability to transcend individualistic urges and work together to achieve social progress, whatever that may be, it was still only after we were persuaded that something is in for us as individuals too. And now that we're onto that topic, the only system that has consistently been able to do that is capitalism. People would have never risked their lives to build tunnels inside mountains so richer folk can get faster from one end to the other via the train unless there was something in it for them too. And transportation is social progress, at least in my conservative view of the world. But anyway, without knowing what examples she has in mind, it's hard for us to come up with an efficient argument because, again, in such disputes, the point is not to convince the interlocutor. The point, I mean, we already established that that Abby Wilkinson doesn't believe a iota of what she writes. The purpose here is to convince the audience, which is why providing examples without insight into her mind is inefficient. Alright, so let's see her argument onto why we should abolish one of the most important pillars of our civilization. Quote, in contemporary times, most people agree that tax should facilitate transfer of wealth from those who have to those who need. Public spending is messy and complicated, but the overall redistributive flow is from the relatively rich to the comparatively poorer. Justifications for not totally eradicating income, I think she meant income inequality here, have both moral and practical arguments. It's argued that people morally deserve to be rewarded for being good at their job, and also that society needs to offer financial rewards to encourage people to work hard and be productive. Neither of these arguments really apply in the case of inheritance. Morally speaking, people who stand to inherit large sums haven't done anything to earn that money. An accident of birth placed them in a comparatively wealthy family, and they've benefited from that their whole life. Some people who stand to inherit have struggled too, but so have many people who won't inherit anything at all. Again, very nice obfuscation. Now you will notice this particularly asinine framing. Oh yes, some who stand to inherit have struggled, true, but who cares about those? After all, many people have struggled and won't inherit anything. Wah, 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 that's unfair, smirk. The problem is that this misses out the majority of the cases, and the majority of the cases aren't the rich dumb kid who knows nothing about anything. And speaking of those cases, there already is a 100% inheritance tax on those. I mean, rich dumb kids tend to squander their family's wealth really fast, and the market, by means of incentives, redistributes that wealth from the unworthy spoiled brat to the worthy. So even when it comes to social justice-y goals, capitalism still is better than mental disorder or socialism. But I repeat myself. Anyway, I was saying that her analysis doesn't cover the majority of the cases, and here's why. In most cases involving inheritance, you have middle-class people whose biggest asset is their house, otherwise known as the family home, and maybe some savings in the bank. That is your typical case, and in the current era, when parents live quite long lives, the point of inheritance comes quite late in the life of the offspring, and by that time, the offspring has already made investments of his own into the family home, or contributed to the health and well-being of his or her parents, or both. Moreover, in many, if not most cases, the inheritor already has an adult child already when inheritance comes up, and with the low opportunities existent for young people today, an inheritance like that will definitely mitigate at least some of the problem. The point with this is that the argument that the offspring did nothing to deserve it is simply a lie. In the overwhelming majority of the cases, the very fact that there is something to inherit at all is owed, at least in part, to the one inheriting. Now, it is true that it is also an accident of birth, but we normal people call that life. And it's very dangerous slope to argue that something should be forcibly removed by the state just because it is in part or in full the result of an accident of birth. I mean, this is a very dangerous road, straight into Vonnegut's 2048. I mean, after all, IQ is in part an accident of birth. Being able to speak without stuttering severely is in part an accident of birth. Attractiveness is also mostly genetic. Having impeccably functional eyes, or not, like me, is at least in part genetic. Should the jobs of pilots be opened for everyone, including people like me, just because it is unfair that those who can pass the eyesight test can do so solely because of an accident of birth? I'm sure Abby doesn't believe that, but it really doesn't matter, because once you open the Pandora's box on this argument, there really is no way back. All right, let's read further. Quote, "It is sometimes claimed that the prospect of leaving an inheritance motivates people to work harder, but I'm skeptical that self-interest isn't enough. Where's the evidence that people without children are less productive on average, and those who are motivated by a desire to help their family will presumably still want to do so while they're alive?" Well, actually, there is substantive and I would say compelling evidence that the prospect of leaving an inheritance motivates people to work harder. It is directly connected to the more general motivation that people who have children tend to work harder, and having children means wanting to build or leave something to or for them. Also, it is true that those who are motivated by a desire to help their family will presumably still want to do so while they're alive, but they will not do it in the same way. Here, Abby either intentionally avoids or legitimately doesn't understand the concept of incentives. A 100% inheritance tax means that I won't be helping my parents maintaining the family home. It would be cheaper to help them with rent somewhere else. The only reason I help with the family home as it is now is because I know that is my home too, because I am the heir. If I knew for sure it will be stolen from my family once my folks pass away, I would instantly sell it now and put the shekels into a property in a country that is not insane, or would put them in unregistered gold to leave that as inheritance to either my children or my nieces or someone else. Incentives matter. Seriously, they really do. All right, let's read more. Quote, honestly, if people did decide to retire earlier and enjoy their later years instead of slaving away for as long as possible, would that be such a bad thing? And given that youth unemployment is such an issue, it may well be socially beneficial to free up those jobs. Well, nice appeal to emotion, Abby, but except it doesn't really work that way. In a free economy, which admittedly the United Kingdom is less and less of, it is rarely the case that the jobs sought by young people are exactly the jobs still being done by 70-year-olds or even 55-year-olds. Now that's one thing. The second thing is that it is precisely capitalism or liberal economics that even made retirement possible to begin with. I mean, before the 19th century, the very concept of retirement did not exist. In pre-capitalist societies, people would slave away, to use her terminology, literally until their deaths. It is precisely capitalism that made specialization and division of labor possible to create so much wealth that one could produce enough in his prime years to also support him during his old age. Also, in a free society, there is such thing as the right to work. The right and not the obligation. The only societies where there is an obligation to work as much as or as little as some authority wants you to are the feudal societies and communist societies. It is only capitalist societies that have made this magnificent concept of individuals having the freedom to work as much or as little as they want. So, what she's arguing is essentially for a communist society where the state tells you when to retire and forbids you from working further. Now, in addition to that, there is such thing as individual difference, which, yes, leads to different outcomes. But that is fantastic and not something to stamp out. Believe me, I lived in the world where we were all roughly the same. And it sucked. And it sucked bigly. Anyway, let's read more. Quote, some may argue that leaving inheritance is a moral right. It's not about whether the recipients deserve or need it, nor whether having the ability to do so results in productivity gains. The point is that the deceased earned that money and it should be up to them where it goes. And this is where it gets a little murky. We tend to honor the wishes of the dead, at least to some extent. Those of us who are religious may believe their souls live on and they can witness what's happening. Even committed atheists recognize the value of respect in this context, even if their primary concern is the emotional impact on those left behind. If someone wanted a certain sort of funeral, for example, it seems right to try and fulfill that. But what if the desires of the dead directly damage the well-being of the living? Is there any situation in which the previous instructions of someone no longer actually present in the mortal realm should be prioritized over the needs, interests, and opinions of those who are still alive and kicking? In the United Kingdom, official statistics suggest around £77 billion is passed on in inheritance each year. Tax avoidance means the real amount could be even higher. That's money that no living being has a moral claim to, according to standard justifications of wealth inequality and private property. Were that money redistributed by the state, it would cover the cost of adult social care several times over. It could plug gaps in NHS, education, and police funding. It could provide the kind of comprehensive welfare state that meant nobody had to worry about their family after they have passed away, because there would always be a safety net. Now remember, these are the people who say greed is bad. I mean, but seriously, who is greedy over here? I mean, who is the greedy one in this story? The vast majority of the public who think the taxman already takes enough from inheritance through various ways, such as inheritance tax, capital gains tax, because the money inherited don't just get locked up somewhere. They get invested. And speaking of, there are investment taxes in some places. Of course, the taxman also takes from VAT and so on and so forth. The point is that the taxman already takes a significant chunk of that anyway. But Abby here argues that it should take everything. So who exactly is the greedy one here? Remember, this kind of point is to convince the audience, not the interlocutor. So when you're faced with a moral argument like this one, it is imperative that you answer with a moral and character counter-argument. If you do it under the moral framework of the interlocutor, like I just did here by calling her greedy, now that is even better. Overall, besides emotional appeal and full morality, her argument is predicated, like always with socialists, on economic illiteracy. And she goes on with that. Quote, "Cultural norms teach us that the inheritance of private property is the default and any expropriation of this wealth must be justified. It should be the other way around. There's some value in respecting the wishes of the dead, yes, but why is that more important than social housing, healthcare, or any number of other possible uses for the money? It's natural to want to protect and care for your family, but what about people who don't stand to inherit a penny? Is there any reason their needs should matter less? We have to fund our state somehow. What makes inheritance tax more objectionable than income tax or VAT charged on essential consumer goods?" Well, yes, there is a reason the needs of those who don't stand to inherit a penny matter less. It's not their money. In general, the argument for this type of insanity really does come from economic illiteracy and also from a clear ignorance or maybe purposeful obfuscation of how things work in present. First of all, in most cases, as I explained earlier, it's not even about actual money. It's an asset, the family home, most of the time. And the number she talks about, 77 billion pounds being passed on in inheritance every year, now that is not in total actual money. It's assets potentially worth as much as 77 billion pounds. Strictly on the United Kingdom, an apartment like the one I live in here can cost as much as £1 million in certain areas of London, and even in crappy areas, it still goes as much as 600,000, likely a lot more. Even if the parents bought it for £40,000 40 years ago and did minimal maintenance on it, when it is inherited, it goes in the statistics as a 600 or 700,000 pounds or more worth of inheritance. So the only way Abby's vision could be applied would be to have the government come in and seize it and then sell it. But then again, sell it to whom? Because most of the people buying, again, except the outliers of very rich people, will be people who have some inheritance money and perhaps contract a mortgage on top of it. But then if no one has inheritance money, the only other way would be to compel everyone into difficult mortgages, or to have the government force the prices down, which would create overcrowding and an overall degeneration of the whole infrastructure of the housing units. Because if it is not mine, I won't care if it goes to dust. What would happen, actually, in such a system, though, would be all the interesting and productive people just leaving the United Kingdom, and everyone else would be worse off overall. This has been happening already in France. Now, I've talked about this in past videos. When tax bills hit 120% of one's income, and no, I'm not joking, that's when the exodus commenced. The vast majority of entrepreneurial people and most of the rich people simply left. That's why there isn't any significant business growth to speak of in France, just perpetual stagnation and slow degeneration. This would happen to the United Kingdom as well. This whole idea that all socialists seem to have, that somehow this time will be different, is what's keeping this obviously wrong set of ideas alive. Remember, in the 1950s, commies believed communism would work because now we have tractors, developed and delivered by capitalists, but let's set that aside for a second. In late 1990s, Maduro in Venezuela believed this time communism would work because now there's oil, It didn't matter that oil is bought overwhelmingly by capitalists to build the products that communists can't even dream of. We're currently witnessing the results of that mentality over in Venezuela. In the current year, the commies seem to believe that communism would now work because we have X or Y technology or even AI. That's why there is a sudden uptick these days of very old and very retarded ideas such as universal basic income or 100% inheritance tax and so on and so forth. It really doesn't work. Anyway, in the last paragraph, Abby shows to us why she's dangerous, because she knows what she's doing. She's not your average naive SJW idealist. Quote, a 100% estate tax, perhaps with a small allowance for objects of sentimental value, isn't a policy we can expect to see in a party manifesto anytime soon. It's well outside the current spectrum of mainstream political opinion. Questioning the status quo is always going to be a somewhat uncomfortable process, though, and all kinds of major social changes seemed impossible until suddenly they weren't. And this, my fellow deplorables, is why starting up the rotors sounds less and less of a joke and more of a good idea. Because it's scum like this why nobody can have nice things. And again, this is not a new idea, nor is it a new debate. That's why I say liberty can only obtain victories but never win, because entropy is sadly with the stupid. And I don't say that all ideas are old just to sound smart or anything. They really are old. For instance, almost 170 years ago, Frédéric Bastiat, a French intellectual that you should study instead of Sartre or Rousseau, was saying the following, quote, socialism, like the ancient ideas from which it springs, confuses the distinction between government and society. As a result of this, every time we object to a thing being done by government, the socialists conclude that we object to its being done at all. We disapprove of state education, then the socialists say we are opposed to any education. We object to a state religion, then the socialists say that we want no religion at all. We object to a state-enforced equality, then they say we are against equality, and so on and so on. It is as if the socialists were to accuse us of not wanting persons to eat because we don't want the state to raise grain. Now this is funny because 100 years after Bastiat wrote this, socialists actually did accuse us of not wanting people to eat because we don't want the state to raise grain. And not only accuse us, but put us in gulags for opposing the scientific progress of society. The scientific progress whose agricultural policies led to Holodomor, among other things, but that's a discussion for another time. The point is that this author knows what she's doing and is engaged in a cultural war, which is why the forces of the non-left need to be armed and ready to return fire, because if they don't, everyone is in deep trouble. That's how many terrible ideas became policy. One stellar example of this is the income tax. The income tax is by far one of the most growth-hindering policy existent in modern Western societies. It is taken for granted even by many who call themselves classical liberals or conservatives. But there's nothing liberal, in the classical sense, in allowing the state to watch everyone's transactions and abolishing the entirety of privacy and essentially shifting the premise that my own labor, represented through money, is first of all the property of government. When the income tax became a thing, the forces of the non-left did not even understand how it had happened. And that's precisely because they didn't pay attention to the progressive subversion. Or if they did, they chose to ignore it and pretend that the cultural fight is not necessary. As I said in other videos, you may not be interested in the ideological war, but the war is interested in you, and especially your money. So these ideas need to be fought now, not 20 years from now, because if this madness is not sent back into the degenerate hole it crawled out of, it will be much harder to put it back when it becomes a bill in a parliament somewhere. Politics is downstream from culture. Everyone says that, but not enough of the non-left understand what it means and how to apply it. And that needs to change. And it's great that it is changing. Not fast enough, but hey, we're in a better shape than we were 20 years ago, so there's that. All right, I think that's enough for now. Remember, this is to give ammunition to normal people so they can use it when encountering helicopterables spouting this nonsense. So with that in mind, please do tell me in the comments if you have even better or different arguments to use than the ones I provided. Let's collect some ammunition here because we're definitely going to need it. So with all of that being said, thank you all for watching. Thank you for your consistent and generous support. Follow me on the usual social media, links in the description. Consider giving a shekel to this whole thing running out. And yeah, I'll see you all soon on Freedom Alternative.